see that it's the problem translating, verbal descriptions into a picture. And so we have had an idea that we thought we'd ask you. In that bag, I have a plastic model, life-size, of a human skull. And I was wondering whether you'd be willing to draw what you remember of the wound on that in magic marker.
Yeah. Well, as I've told you over the telephone, my exposure in that room was very brief.
Yeah.
I went in and applied the electrodes to the president's body to see if he had any electrocardiographic activity, if he had any activity in his heart, electrical activity in his heart.
Where did that put you in relation to the body? What position?
Approximately by his right shoulder.
By his right shoulder.
And he was lying on his back?
Yes.
With his head flat on the back, or turned to one side, or he was lying flat on his back with his head back?
And it was facing straight forward. It was facing the ceiling.
Facing up.
So you would have had a fairly good view of his head.
Yeah, I think I had a pretty good view.
And you were at his right shoulder.
But,
and you helped place those electrodes on his chest.
now I did. So as such, I saw the wound, but I really didn't examine the wound. You see, I really didn't make a detailed mental image of the wound at that time.
Do you feel you have enough of a memory that you could try to
Well, I think
make a drawing?
well, I can give you my opinion about what my memory is.
Well, why don't we try the drawing, if you don't mind? I think it would just, this is a plastic model, but it's supposed to be accurate. Maybe the rubber band anymore. We're trying to glue it together. And that pen will make a rather fine mark, but it has the advantage that we can wash it off, because we only have one of our friends here.
Well, I can do it with my finger.
Well, it would help us to have an image that we can then record, maybe take a photo of later or something like that, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay. As I remember the wound, something like this.
Could you describe what you're drawing as you draw it?
Well, okay, I'm drawing a large defect in the skull that measures maybe 10 centimeters across by maybe 20 centimeters long. The defect is in the right side of the skull, extending from probably the occipital area and the area just above the mastoid process forward to the suture line between the frontal and the parietal bone, and then superiorly almost to the midline.
You've drawn it primarily in the parietal area, haven't you?
Yep.
Most of the other doctors, I think it's fair to say, characterize it as occipital parietal. Is that?
Well, I've overlapped the occipital bone here. I've got about, my defect shows about 3 or 4 centimeters into the occipital bone.
I see. How long were you in the room altogether?
The length of time required to attach these electrodes, which probably 5 minutes.
5 minutes, that's what you said before the warrant function, too.
Can you tell us what kind of tissue, brain tissue, or tissue at all you saw?
Oh yeah, there was brain tissue on the cart. There was
completely
considerable
severed from
yeah,
the...
right. Detached brain tissue on the cart. There was a lot of blood, and there was brain tissue visible in the wound, some brain tissue visible in the wound. I couldn't tell you what areas of the brain were exposed.
Do you recall whether you saw any cerebellar tissue?
No, it was, what I saw was fairly macerated. It was destroyed. It was recognizable as brain tissue, but I don't believe I could have done any more exact analysis than that.
Were the borders of the wound fairly easy to distinguish, or were they obscured either by tissue spilling out or by blood, or?
Well, the inferior border, I don't recall.
You started to say something.
I was going to say there was a pool of blood that the head was laying in, so the inferior border of the wound was obscured by
that.
Well, now that wouldn't be the inferior, that would be the posterior border. Was obscured because the head was laying in a pool of blood.
So that made it perhaps somewhat hard to tell just how far back towards the occiput that wound went.
Right.
Was the head moved while you were there at all, or was anyone looking at it or trying to make a closer examination?
I don't recall.
You don't recall.
Yeah, Dr. Clark was there, and he was examining the head.
At one point, I noticed in, I guess when you gave your deposition for the Warren Commission, you at that point remembered the wound as being on the left side of the head. I gather that was
Probably a typographical error.
you think it's several times because you were asked about it and you said was it on the left? And you said, well, that's my memory, but it was, I didn't watch it very long. I think it was what you said.
There was an exchange between you and Arlen Spector, who was the interviewer. Yeah, I remember the interview. He said, was that the left-hand side of the head or the right-hand side of the head? You said, I would say the left, but this is just my memory of it. You've now put it on the right.
The problems over 17 years.
I don't recall it being on the left.
Yeah. Maybe you're just a little nervous that day.
Possible.
Yeah. But there wasn't anything that you saw that might have given you that impression at that point that there was that wound, or any wound on the other side.
No.
So did you basically see it then from that one perspective? You were standing there at his right shoulder and you viewed it from there. You didn't sort of move around or
No.
to an extent, and
I
left
just
the
reached
room.
across, put the electrodes on, and then I was called across the hall because the governor was across the hall with a sucking chest wound, and I went over and took care of him.
Do you recall speaking to a researcher by the name of Harry Livingstone?
Yes.
You mentioned that to me.
Yes.
He, I believe, showed you a picture such as this, which...
No, it wasn't a picture. It was a picture that...
The autopsy
have
picture?
Right, the book, this doesn't look like the picture you showed me at all. That's the picture.
This purports to be an exact tracing done by an artist named Ida Dox of the rear view of the president's head taken at the autopsy. I believe Livingston, he told us about your conversations, and we're frankly, we're not taking his word for anything, but I just wanted to ask you about it. I believe he quoted you as saying that this did not resemble the head as you had viewed it.
That's right. Because I hadn't really analyzed my thoughts about the picture, but in retrospect, I can see what the picture portrays, and I think it is compatible with what I saw.
You do?
Yeah. You see, in this picture, the scalp is being held up, and there's a large flap of bone here.
You mean the flap is the skull? Okay, right.
See, that's a portion of this piece of bone right here. It's folded over like that. So what they've done to get this picture is to, without folding the flap of bone back over the defect, back over the hole here, they've just pulled the scalp up in front so that you can see the bullet hole which was there. And I think this is very compatible with what we saw.
But this flap does not come down this far, does it?
Oh, yeah.
Well,
See, it's attached.
there doesn't appear to be any defect in this area, though.
That's because the scalp is covering it.
So the scalp was loose over the area where the bone had been blown away?
The scalp has a tear in it, which undoubtedly is over here somewhere. And instead of putting the bone back in place and then folding the scalp back over it, well, they just pulled the scalp over it and left the bone segment attached and exposed there.
So this flap here is what exactly? Is bone
That's a piece of this
Something
bone
like
that's still attached, probably by the temporalis muscle, and it's turned inside out. You see, folded back towards the front of towards the face.
I see. And now, so I gather you're saying that there was a considerable area of scalp tissue that, although torn open, was not entirely blown away.
All right, look. Forget this bone. Pretend that my hand is the bone now, all right? And then on top of the bone, of course, is the scalp. Now, when the accident occurred, what happened was the scalp, which apparently had a laceration in it somewhere along there, folded back this way. The bone came loose up that way. Now then, in order to expose the bullet wound in the picture, what they did was just pull the scalp back this way and lift this piece of bone out there, see? The bone is attached up here by heavy muscles.
What bullet wound are you referring to?
This bullet wound right here.
But surely this bone wouldn't have come back all the way to here, would it have?
Oh, yeah.
Well, it could have been, some set of the fragments were gone, obviously.
The bullet wound could just be a little hole right here.
See, I think what Ben's getting at is that fragment, that flap, probably covers part of the way back.
Oh,
not
yeah.
the whole thing.
Well, there are large
parts that were gone.
Parts of it were gone. They were blown up in the air. If you look at the fragments flying in the Zapruder film, you can see that there were probably 20 fragments of bone that came loose. This just happened to be one fragment, a major fragment that remained attached, probably by the muscles on the skull there.
And then there was scalp tissue that actually covered over some of the area where the bone, if moved back to its natural position, would actually cover over some of the area where the bone was no longer there.
Probably cover it all, because the scalp tissue wouldn't be lost. It's more flexible and elastic and tends to stay there than bone, which would be broken and separated.
I see. So in your view, this picture, the reason this doesn't look at first glance like what you saw is that you think that the scalp may have been moved back into position where it normally would be, rather than being sort of blown out of the way.
Yeah, that's my opinion of this picture now. And then I called Livingstone about that later on and told him about that. He didn't seem to be very interested.
Oh, you did?
Yes, I did. And I told that to Lifton, too.
Oh, really? Did Lifton query you about this as well?
Yes, he inquired.
You're not quoted in the book.
Probably not.
Seemed to be
didn't help
you were the
thesis.
dissident, huh?
Well,
In his, as for his
I
theory.
still am. I think that this is very compatible with the ones that we saw.
How about the other pictures?
Well, that other picture I showed you, this one. You know what this is? Or what,
No, I
what
have
it,
no
what
idea
it
what
purports to be. This was a drawing that appeared in a book by Professor Josiah Thompson about the assassination, called 6 Seconds in Dallas. And it represented a drawing based on the description by Dr. McClellan that he gave to the Warren Commission, which was a quite detailed description. I have that briefly here.
Are you going to be able to talk to McClellan?
Well, we don't have a clear agreement on it yet. We're sort of trying to work it out. But
He said that he was in, quote, such a position that I could very closely examine the head wound, and I noted that the right posterior portion of the skull had been extremely blasted. It had been shattered, apparently, by the force of the shot, so that the parietal bone was protruded up through the scalp and seemed to be fractured along its right posterior half, as well as some of the occipital bone being fractured in its lateral half.
See, there's the piece of bone extruding through the scalp right there.
And this sprung open the bones that I mentioned in such a way that you could actually look down into the skull cavity itself and see that probably a third or so, at least, of the brain tissue, posterior cerebral tissue, and some of the cerebellar tissue had been blasted out.
Yeah, I agree with that.
There was a large amount of bleeding which was occurring mainly from the large venous channel in the skull. Anyway,
Well, I believe that this picture is more compatible with that description than that picture.
how does that picture relate to what you remember at all?
It doesn't.
It was looked nothing like
You're
that.
referring now to this 6 seconds in Dallas drawing. Livingston had quoted you in his little transcript that he prepared of his conversation with you as saying that although it had been a long time from what you saw, this was a reasonable representation.
No, I never saw that.
He never showed you this?
No, he showed me this. He showed me this thing right here.
He says,
And he asked me very simply if this was a clear representation. I said at the time it was not. But the picture that he had was actually a pencil drawing similar to this of this picture. See, and I didn't recognize anything off the picture. But then I got to thinking about it. I said, no, that picture was right.
maybe there's a misunderstanding. He says here that he's showing you,
Are you sure it's
140, page 140 of 6 Seconds in Dallas, which is this photo, but anyway. He also mentioned that you picked up the skull,
no, not that you, but
or someone else did, and shined the light inside the skull. Do you recall that?
Yeah, I have no knowledge of that.
You don't.
Because it may have been done after I left. You see, that when I left, the president was there another 25 minutes after I left, and I went across the hall to the governor.
I see. So he somehow got the impression, okay, he said it to you that some of this had happened, and he got the impression that you were agreeing that, yeah, you'd seen that happen, but you did not.
No, I didn't see anybody shining a flashlight.
He quotes you
as saying, was the head lifted up from the table and somebody looked at it, you saying, yeah, he asked you, did you do that? And you answered, in fact, we shined the light in the cranial vault there and noticed a large amount of something missing. Are you fuzzy on that, or?
Fuzzy.
I see.
Very
So
fuzzy.
you don't recall that now? You don't?
No, I don't recall that now.
Recalling that conversation, you think that's accurate?
Where did he publish that?
Oh, it's just a little newsletter. It was
newsletter,
not published. It circulates among the critics. It was not published.
I recall a conversation I had with him. He was working for the Baltimore newspaper at the time.
He was, well, it's unclear who he was with.
He's on his own, basically. He's tried to, bring his interest other people in it, including us, in various things.
In answer to this kind of question, I just have to say I have to rely on what I wrote down and what I testified to the Warren Commission, because I just don't remember that.
Did you have some sort of written description at the time that you did?
Oh yeah,
Your written report, if you filed one, doesn't appear in the Warren Commission records.
Dr. Jenkins does. Let's see.
Yeah, there's one by Jenkins, that's correct.
And
This is your written report?
right, which was published in Texas Medical Journal.
Oh, really?
Have you read some of the quoted opinions of your colleagues in the Lifton book?
No.
But why? Well, basically, I guess that they, at least in his interpretation, they seem to place the wound further to the back than you have in the occipital area. Why? What do you think is the reason for the confusion on this, if any?
Well, because nobody really drew a picture of it. They just described it. Descriptions are subject to errors of interpretation. And furthermore, the efforts that our doctors made at the time were really directed toward trying to resuscitate the president rather than trying to examine his wounds in any great detail. I think that we recognize from this viewpoint that we should have done a more careful examination at the time. But we thought that the body would go to our morgue and be autopsied here in Dallas by Dr. Rose, who was our forensic pathologist at that time, and was superb, did autopsies on about 300 murders a year, and really did a very detailed and excellent job. So we didn't, at the time, we weren't accustomed to doing a careful examination of it in this kind of situation because we didn't have to. He did it later on. It turned out now in this retrospective light that that was not the case.
But you wouldn't normally examine a body after death, would you? In any case, if somebody dies on the operating room, the emergency room floor, you don't examine them after death, do you?
No, because that's the job of the coroner.
Exactly.
So it's just not, clearly wasn't the thing foremost in anyone's mind at that point. You're trying to render whatever medical attention you could.
Yeah. See if there was a chance to save your life. Turned out it wasn't.
By the way, let me just interrupt for a moment. I tried to darken the line you drew. Do you still agree that is the line you drew? All right. Oh, is there any possibility from what you recall, is there a possibility that there was perhaps a wound area here and a separate one back here, a large one as opposed to just one small bullet hole, that either were connected or separate?
Oh, there's a possibility there were many other reasons.
I see. But that's what you
the
saw.
one that I saw.
Right.
And I didn't do a detailed examination, so there's a possibility of any number of other ones.
Do you have the other drawing, the other two drawings? You've seen this one before?
Why don't you
Yeah, that's
describe
from
that?
Adam.
Yeah, right, exactly.
That's what I believe happened.
And that's consistent.
I'm a fan of Latterman. That's what I think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And you feel that's consistent with what you remember?
Yeah, right.
What you drew?
And this piece of bone here, this fragment of bone is the one that's probably turned out and sticking out of the scalp.
In the other,
Maybe
in the
a
other
piece
drawing.
of this piece too, but he actually traced all these pieces on the recruiter film, so I imagine his interpretation is pretty accurate.
But back to the autopsy photograph, and just so I'm clear on this flap, you're saying that this flap would fold back towards the rear of the head, and it would extend perhaps as far back as...
What you're looking at there is the surface that normally is against the brain.
Uh-huh.
And this surface out here is the surface that normally is underneath the scalp. So you're looking, it's turned inside out and folded forward.
And that if folded back, it would extend all the way to the rear of this black line as you've drawn it?
I don't know how big a piece it is. I don't know whether it's a little fragment like this. It might just be a little fragment. It is a fairly sizable fragment, so it would cover a large. You can see it's a fragment which is.
Well, this fragment here, now referring to the Latimer drawing, this appears to be folded down, and that this would fold back up this way. Is that correct? Whereas this, the way you pointed
Appears
out,
to be
referring to the
folded
autopsy photo, yeah, appears to be folded forward. Now, is there any possibility that this flap could be folded downward and could go up towards the top of the head? In your view, that it's possible? Well, if that were the case, would you still adhere to your opinion that it extended back as far as you've drawn it on the head?
Oh, yeah, because, well, I don't know how, like I say, I don't know where that fragment is attached. I don't know how large it is in comparison to the defect. I don't know how much of the defect it would cover. It may cover the whole defect. I don't know. I doubt it, because I think there were some pieces missing.
But in your view, by the appearance of this autopsy photograph on page 104 of the House Assassinations Committee, it appears to be folded forward.
It appears to be.
I don't have anything else. Do you?
No, I've taken care of my questions.